whether we talk about half Earth or whether we talk about 30 by 30 by 2030, these are important goals, laudable goals, and I don't mean in any way to minimize them, but achieving them will mean a great deal less than it could or should unless we act on climate change urgently. It is very clear that we have already passed the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal set at the Paris Accords. We will not meet it. That's simply clear. We need a few more years of data to make that absolutely confirmatory, but no climate scientist thinks we're going to meet 1.5 degrees. Very few think that we're going to meet 2 degrees centigrade. And many of them believe we're headed for a 3 degrees centigrade world. That is frightening in many respects because it will change ecosystems. So setting aside land or water under those conditions means that that land and that water itself is going to be changed a great deal. Biodiversity will be lost. It will be harder to farm. It will be harder to live for many people in many areas. We'll have climate refugees, we'll have political instability, and we'll have financial instability. In addition to which, for the longer term, we'll have rising seas. Already we know that sea levels are going to rise for centuries, that nothing will stop them. So we are facing a climate situation which is truly urgent. I mean, there are some physicists who say already that we are facing a doomsday scenario. I talked with some of them this past week in Washington, D.C. They feel very discouraged by where we're headed on climate. So slashing emissions is absolutely vital. We will need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There are a number of methods to do that, but right now, even though we're employing some of them, their impact so far has been minuscule. And we may even need to contemplate solar geoengineering. That is where a lot of climate scientists are increasingly turning their views, despite the moral hazard involved with it. So climate is ubiquitous, and unless we do something about it, our other efforts, however laudable, will be minimized to some degree. They may even, in some instances, be defeated. We're in a perilous situation, and what we do in the next 10, 15 years on climate is going to determine so much in the future. I think something else we can do is we can educate people on climate. There's still a lot of misinformation and disinformation about climate. Does your school require environmental courses as a public school? Do colleges require some work in environment for graduation, some information on climate? Most schools and colleges don't do this at all. I think it's imperative that we educate our young people on that. The fact that this question on environment and climate came at the tail end of a presidential debate is discouraging. A lot of voters list climate somewhere between priority number 7 and priority number 16 on their voting priority. And sadly enough, it seems, according to polls, that people who list it as number 1 and 2 as a group vote less often than other people, which is truly discouraging. But I just wanted to make that simple point that climate is foundational for absolutely everything else. And unless we act on that, our other actions will, however strenuous they are, not be what they could be.
I probably would disagree a bit with Jim on his statement that climate is foundational. I think climate change and the causes of climate change are integrally linked with biodiversity loss and the conservation of species. If you look at one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world, it's forests. And so protecting 50% of the forests, you're going to, maybe with or without geoengineering, you might be able to at least make some headway on this problem. But I would hate to see climate change versus biodiversity conservation become an issue. And I know you weren't just implying that, Jim, but I think we need to be careful of what we, how we.
No, they're all interlinked. You're right,
Yeah.
John. They're all interlinked, absolutely. But if we keep on, I mean, last year, global emissions were at an all-time historical high. If we keep that up, the trajectory is one of failure for so much else.
Yeah, and we should have our other panelists chime in, but my feeling is that will affect all species on the planet. And whatever we can do to preserve some of those species besides Homo sapiens is an important thing to do.
So I think that the issue here is that from a greenhouse gas point of view, if deforestation occurs in a commodity supply chain, wherever it occurs, it is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. That's how important the carbon is in the forest. We did analyses of 12 different global commodities, and that was always the case, even with things like rice, with methane production, and even with cattle, it was the same. That if the land was cleared from forest, that was even a bigger impact than the ruminants and the methane production from rumination of the livestock. But I think that it's also the case that we need to focus on what the substitutes are that actually reduce those impacts. So we found that with traceability for soy, for example, from Brazil, you could reduce by half the emissions that were being produced to produce global salmon if soy was included as a 15% ingredient in the feed. And so you do have the ability to reduce these emissions by having better traceability, better transparency about how things are produced. The EU deforestation regulation is requiring traceability all the way back to farms. China's starting to require some of this stuff, but we don't want this to go the way of voluntary standards, which was to reward the better producers and let the worst ones get off the hook, undersell, and undermine the markets. So how do we put in global minimum performance standards so that traded food items have to be produced that maintain the environment or actually improve it? And if they don't, they're not allowed to be traded. When do we start putting environmental protections in place under the WTO? Codex Alimentarius does this for human health and safety. Why not Codex Planetarius for planetary health and safety?